housing manager on reserve in Tsawout First Nation on Vancouver Island. I work a lot with Ecotrust as well, and I work a lot in the energy management sector. And I wanted just to talk about the material reality of energy poverty. So in the on a reserve context, not a lot of families have a lot of control over what their house is. The ability to move around makes it, the inability to move within the community means that homes will be heavily used from the moment that they're created. So, in a very real way, the energy poverty that exists in community is also the housing poverty. So the justice of energy has to come both from the management of upgrading and improving housing, but also the energy systems inside those houses. So in a very, very material way, energy justice is housing justice. And this comes from a large systemic issue. Reserves are unnatural places. They are the product of dispossession. And so not a lot of communities had a lot of autonomy over how their housing infrastructure was being created. The older programs, when no one hears from the CMHC, that's what I was told, thank God. When the Veteran Housing Corporation, which became the CMHC, started building houses on reserve in the 60s, they had unilaterally decided what houses were going to be constructed. And this means that in every reserve in Canada has the same style of housing, regardless of its environmental conditions. And this is a problem because out here in the west, we have a lot of humidity. In the north, it's quite cold. And then out in the east, you have cold and humidity. And so all these systems need community-appropriate solutions. And the impact of that is the legacy issues of on-reserve housing, which are a limited number of units, overcrowding, high levels of high occupancy, and extremely little mobility within the community to move. It's quite common for us all to, if we don't like where we live, to just move to a different area. But reserves, because of the dispossession, are quite emotionally fragile places where people don't want to leave. And so they tend to accept their material conditions instead of actually working towards resolving them. And the existing programs that are out there, like the Greener Homes Grant that we know, the Income Qualified Program through BC Hydro, are all really incomplete solutions because they're trying to resolve something on the demand side. They're trying to say, oh, we just want them to spend less money. But what we really need is just more houses, which seems like a no-brainer. But not that I don't want to continuously shit talk the CMHC. What is now called the Section 95 program used to be called the Section 82 program before 1995. And that was in a response to the Bill C-31. There was a huge amount of Indians that came out of nowhere. Well, not nowhere, it was a whole other story. And the government needed to find a way to house them all because they knew that there was going to be a lot of people coming back to the reserves. So after 1985 to 1995 was a big blitz in housing. And so we created what's known as the Section 95 Affordable Housing Program. Well, the Section 95 Affordable Housing Program is a program that builds affordable housing on reserve. And it does it through low interest, well, not low interest, they do it through financing the construction of houses. And so in the early days, what they would do is they would give them a selection of houses to build, and they would project manage it for them. And then after 1995, that changed into the nations having a lot more project management agency over these houses. But they're not actually supporting the creation of affordable housing. They're subsidizing the financing of that housing, which means that at the end of the day, the banks are still getting the maximum amount of interest on their loans to First Nations to build affordable housing. And then nations are subsidized on their payments. So we really only generate about 5% of what we should be generating off of our rental revenue, which means that we're kind of handcuffed in our capacity to deliver housing programming and also to save up money to build new houses. This causes the intergenerational poverty of housing, because the families who are not able to move or not interested in moving are now forced to live in these homes that cannot be financially maintained without further government support. This is where the energy justice comes in. I learned, and this is kind of maybe a bit pessimistic through my time in housing, that it's a lot easier to fight for energy upgrades than it is for housing upgrades, because the Liberals like the talking points better. It's a lot easier to say we reduce GHG emissions because the numbers sound bigger. Like when we say the things like, oh, we built 1,200 houses on reserve this year, or we reduced 300,000 tons of GHG emissions, JT is all about those big numbers. And so this really kind of sucks, because that means that even though 1,200 units on reserve would be a huge benefit to communities across Canada, they're not willing to put in that forward investment. And so we end up trying to access as many different kinds of funding as possible. And so this creates a lot of real life consequences. So often, in the reserve work that I do, we'll have families who have, 5 kids, and they have a hydro bill of $900 this month. Well, that's it's 800 times what my bill is every month, and that's because they have 8 kids, so that's 8 showers a day, that's 8 loads of laundry a day probably, all of these different energy uses that are bankrupting them effectively. And no one comes to see you about this problem until it's too late, until the disconnection notice comes in. And so you try to be empathetic. You're like, okay, I'll pay your disconnection notice, but we got to get this on. So we're going to get you a heat pump. We're going to get you windows. But that doesn't change the fact that they have 8 people living in the house consuming 8 people's worth of energy. And many of them can be dependents or extended family. And it's not about the actual individuals consuming the power. It's the injustice that the home was never designed to be efficient enough to allow that kind of energy use to be sustainable. And the ongoing use of that house means that families are putting themselves further in energy poverty and housing poverty, because 8 people is a lot of human moisture. It requires a lot of ventilation. It requires a lot of management of the envelope. And these systems are not easy to maintain for the average person, let alone somebody who's trying to navigate an overcrowded home. So there is like a real material consequence of housing, of energy inefficiency, and it's further than just the couple bucks on your BC Hydro bill. It's the black mold that generates from the lack of ventilation. It's the people who pass away from the heat events. It's also the communities that are dependent on like the influx of diesel in order to subsidize their energy production. Like fortunately, Tsawout is grid connected, so we still have BC Hydro, but these are still incomplete solutions. At the end of the day, the communities need housing, and that housing needs to be highly efficient, community appropriate, and sustainable to operate. Because the financing structure of housing currently makes us really tied to the litigious mechanisms of the CMHC and ISK and all the other bodies that fund housing. And I'm like, you're so smart. So I don't really know how else to explain it, but that's at least my lived experience of on-reserve housing in poverty, and the goal to have that eliminated. And again, it's like the energy is a incomplete solution, but it is by far the easiest money to access federally. Thanks.